Good morning, everyone. We'll get started in a moment. Okay, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us today, where we're going to be talking about demystifying user acceptance testing, or UAT, as we will be referring throughout the rest of the session. So just really some housekeeping rules saying that the session is recorded and will be available on demand afterwards for you to either watch again or share with your colleagues. We want this session to be as interactive as possible, so please do put in your questions to the Q&A box, and myself and Alan will cover off as many of them as we can during the sessions. And then if you have any more sort of technical or support questions, if you put those into the chat box, and we'll be keeping an eye out for those. So those of you who don't know Heart Square, we're a consultancy practice, and I suppose the main message is that we don't sell technology, but we make it work. So our role is very much supporting clients like yourselves on their various different project journeys, and here, not going to go into detail, showing lots of our many years of experience. Thanks, Alan. So I'm Joyce Harmon. I'm Head of Client Services at Heart Square, and delighted to be joined by my colleague Alan this morning. Alan.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Joyce, for the intro. So hi, everyone. My name's Alan Perestrello. Just a little bit more background about my background. I used to be a technology partner. So some of the things that I'm going to be sharing with you today will be based on some of that experience, having been on both sides of the UAT perspective. So back over to you, Joyce.
Perfect. Thanks, Alan. And so, yeah, so, very lucky that we have Alan's perspective, particularly on this topic. So really what we're talking about today, and I suppose to make sure that, everybody is in the right webinar for this morning. So talking about all things UAT. So what does that mean? So UAT, it's the process of verifying that the software system works for its intended uses in the real world environment. So if you're somebody in the middle of an implementation, you might be the project sponsor, the project lead, the tester. This is really the session for you. So wanted to expand on that a bit more, not going to read all of these in great detail, but really thinking about what do we mean by UAT. So it's that phase of testing following on, you've done your discovery, your technology partner's been in that build and development phase, and you're now moving on to that really, and it is a really critical phase, to actually test, to accept, to do the acceptance on the system before you go live. It's really important because it's kind of like that final verification to make sure that the specified functionality is what you expected and it does, as planned. So you're testing for real life scenarios and very much thinking about that kind of end-to-end process to make sure there's not any bits that get missed along the way. You will have to look at prioritization for the most common tasks, but important to think about maybe some ad hoc tasks or more difficult tasks to put in there to make sure you're getting that kind of spread across what the system is going to be. So that they should not be necessarily the priority, but they're an important thing to think about. So moving on to a quote, as we always like a quote, and although this one isn't really specifically looking at data, it's very much thinking about kind of that importance of having a plan. So we really like this one, which is around testing shows the presence, not the absence of bugs. A defect will not be found by the tester, but will be found by a customer. And we all know that's true. If there's something that gets missed, absolutely one of your members or supporters, they will find it. Or equally internally, some of the team who weren't involved in testing, they will find it. So over to you, Alan.
Thank you, Joyce. So just expanding on the definition of user acceptance testing, I think there are some really important points that we have to stress. UAT is really a client responsibility. And from the sort of project's perspective, it's one of the first times that the broader non-project team really become exposed to the project, and they have a lot more responsibility to take on board. So your technology partner, the people that have helped you implement your solution, should be there and will be there to support you. But it's really your organization's responsibility for testing and accepting the system, hence the user acceptance testing phrase. To do that, you need a plan to test and accept the system or feedback any bugs and issues that need to be addressed. And that process does need time to allow the issues that you find to be addressed by the technology partner, played back, and then more testing done until you get to a position where you're happy that the number of tests that are successful represent an acceptable level for your solution or product to go live. Thinking about the different types of testing, you do get different types. And so from a very sort of technical perspective, there is unit tests. Those are things that the developers or solution architects or even potentially QA people will do. But those are things that your organization shouldn't be doing. Then you get to integration testing, which is very similar, but it's about looking at how data flows between different systems that might be integrated in your solution. So a CRM talking to a website, or a CRM talking to a payment gateway for processing donations, or it might be membership renewals, whatever it might be. Those are things that developers do. Still with your, within the tech partner, they will need to do a fair degree of solution testing. And so in that process, they will bring in quality assurance. That's what QA stands for. QA testers who are specialists in just taking the requirements, the user stories, and testing that at a functional level. These have been delivered to the specification. Once those tests are complete, it should then be handed over to the organization, the end client in this case, to test. And that's where your business users really need to ask the question, does the system work to the defined specification? Now, you'll note that I keep referring to that word defined specification. In the context of this, it really depends on how you've approached the project. Typically, waterfall projects tend to be defined by a specification. On the opposite end of the spectrum, agile projects tend to be defined more by epics, and there isn't really a specification because the user stories get defined, in the various sprints. But at the end of the day, the specification in this context determines what was agreed as the requirement for the solution to be delivered to. In terms of some stats, just to help illustrate the importance of doing effective testing, 85% of a project really can be delivered successfully and reduce the number of post-launch defects by 85% if you've done a great degree of user acceptance testing. So that number doesn't seem as high. In a lot of cases, people would expect that 100% should be achieved. I think the reality of projects these days means that there will always be a small degree of minor things that probably do go live. The important thing is that the critical, high importance member or donor facing journeys are not affected by those bugs, and those should be well addressed within the 85%. A really important stat to take away, though, is that if UAT is not done effectively, a bug that isn't found in user acceptance testing that does go all the way through to live and is then visible to either, downstream processes or to, your users, your donors, your members, your customers effectively, that increases to 6 to 15 times in terms of the cost to address those issues after the product has gone live. So it's really important that you do have an effective UAT process and test plan to be able to weed out these bugs and address them before they become evident to the wider public. This is definitely not a quote from someone who participated in user acceptance testing. This is from John Ruskin, who's an art critic and a philosopher. And you can tell by the dress and the grainy black and white picture, this is from the 1890s. But I still think the quote is relevant, that quality is never an accident. It is always the result of intelligent effort. And I would append that by saying equally a fair degree of effort and sometimes hard work, which is what UAT is. It should be an intelligent process delivered by the effort that it takes to work through the solution and make sure that you find the bugs and weed them out.
Thanks, Alan. So I'm just going to bring up a poll. So bear with me. So just to note on this poll, just to make sure everyone's awake this morning, there's two parts to it. So you'll have to scroll down to answer the second part. So what we're really asking here is just to give us an idea of who's with us this morning. Where are you now in your project? It might be that there's no project underway right now. You're scoping out or planning your project. You're in discovery stage. You're in the middle of UAT, or it's the project is live and you're just interested. And on the second part, are there any areas you need help with around knowing where to start, having the resources needed, etc. So I'm just going to let that run for another few seconds. And okay, so I'm going to end the poll and let me share the results. So on the first question of where are people on their project, mainly kind of, I would say, a 50-50 between in that discovery or delivery phase or in UAT now. So I think hopefully this session will be useful for around that. And then, yeah, support needed or questions really around developing the testing strategy and having the resources needed. So I think quite an interesting mix on that. So I'm going to stop sharing and hand back to you, Alan.
Thanks, Joyce, and thanks to everyone for completing that quick poll. Not only does it allow us just to check that everyone's awake and paying attention, but it also allows us to slightly tailor this to answer any specific questions. So just a reminder, if anyone does have any questions, even if you have something you disagree with what we're saying, please do put it into the QA box. We do want these sessions to be as conversational as possible. So looking forward, what I thought was useful now is just to define or help set where testing exists within the journey of getting from a requirement at the start of your project through to a functional system at the end. So at the top, what I've done is I've sort of mapped out what is a very high level, typical sort of stages of a project. So we've got discovery, development, UAT, and then operation. Operation is typically sort of technical term for the product is live and you're using it. So if we now look at the first stage, in the discovery phase, you should be really defining your requirements and building out the specification. So a high-level statement of the business objectives, user needs, and capabilities. Sometimes those requirements will have been captured, or they should have been captured when you went out to tender, and so those requirements then become built on that. But they really are the product of completing the discovery process, which can sometimes take up to 3 to 6 months even. And really what you're doing there is you're defining and writing down exactly what the requirements are. Not necessarily part of the testing, but this is really where really things start. From those high-level specifications, people, typically your solution architects or your business analysts or your consultants from the technology partner will start defining the user stories. Now, the user stories are those great examples, which I'm sure lots of you have seen, as I want to, so I can type structures that help draw out in a more high level, but we're starting to add structure to things. And so you'd find there that user stories typically have a relationship to the requirements in the specification. More complex requirements will probably have 3 or 4 user stories for each one. And then there might be related or interconnected user stories where you've got a complex process. But really, a user story helps capture specific user personas. So that's the as a part, their goals, I want to, and then the expected outcome is the thing that you need to see. And then there's usually a so I can, which is kind of additional detail that helps you flesh out what the function you're trying to build is. Now, this is really the next stage where we start writing acceptance criteria. Now, typically acceptance criteria should be should initially be drawn up by your technology partner or your consultancy, and helping you define those acceptance criteria is really the important part here. And actually, if I'm honest, I think this is an area where I've seen a number of projects not necessarily get delivered properly because the importance of acceptance criteria hasn't really been understood. So really important to take on board there that acceptance criteria need to be specific, so very specific. They need to be measurable. And I think that's the thing that I often see forgotten. How are you going to measure that this is acceptable or not? That defines a very clear pass or fail condition. And I actually think for critical processes or parts of the solution, you really should be defining what fail looks like as well, so that you have a very clear definition of this is acceptable and this is not. And I think this is really the area where I would encourage people to do a lot more work to try and break the back of the test cases or the test scripts and the whole UAT process, And actually, this stage really starts at the beginning of the development process or build, whatever terminology you're using. So it starts relatively early. And I think if these acceptance criteria are really weeded through and understood and owned by the organization, they might be started by the technology partner, but they need to be owned by the organization and hopefully a product owner, and in my preference, a single product owner, one person who's going to understand what pass or fail looks like for the entire solution down to a granular degree. Once you've then got your acceptance criteria, before you enter UAT, you should then be able to define the test scripts. So test script is a step-by-step instruction for validating that the functionality that you're going to be testing, the thing that's been produced before it goes live, is going to meet the specified requirements. Now, those test scripts need to be effectively the answer to the acceptance criteria. So there has to be a really strong correlation and a relationship between those two, because the acceptance criteria really should build your test script. And once your test script is completed and you've done your test, you then should have validated function. In other words, completing the traceability loop that you need from fit for purpose solution that connects everything back to those requirements. So really the important thing here is, and that we do see quite often, is that in the testing phase, things might change. People's expectations of what a solution might look like have evolved, or the organization's requirements have evolved. And it's really a case of looking back and saying, how does this output, the solution, the thing that you're testing, meet the acceptance criteria, which are based on the user stories, which have come from the specification or the requirements that were defined at the outset of the project. So it's important to see those as an interconnected process so that you can complete that loop. If there is an issue where the functionality doesn't meet the expected acceptance criteria, it needs to go back into the development cycle and be fixed. And if it's not a bug and it's very clearly a change, then it needs to go back to the beginning of that process so that it becomes a requirement, a new requirement that then has a new user story, its own acceptance criteria, its own script, and then its own validation for the function. And so sometimes I think it's easy just to sort of at a high level, summarize that into the acceptance criteria is the what needs to be built. The user story is about who and why who it's going to affect and why that functionality needs to be built. The acceptance criteria is how is it going to work? How are we going to test it? The test is the proof that the acceptance criteria meets the requirement, and then validated function is really the outcome, the thing that can go live. So hopefully that helps illustrate at a fairly high level the traceability loop, and that's an important point there, is the traceability of those requirements. If something's being tested in UAT that can't be taken back to a specification or a requirement, it probably shouldn't be tested, but it's actually then probably a consequence of something that's being tested rather than a defined outcome. So really important to take that on board. If we actually now look into the UAT process in a little bit more detail, so again, just bring this together. So in the discovery phase, you'll have your requirements and your specification. In the implementation stage, people start developing those user stories or acceptance criteria. Then the test scripts really should start at the beginning of the implementation phase, in alignment with starting to define your test plan. So at this point, typically your technology partner will go away and they'll start doing lots of configuration of the system, lots of development of the specific functions, all of the things that are unique to your requirements. And at that point, it's a really good opportunity for you as the client, your project manager, or if you've got dedicated testing resources, to start developing that test plan. And really important that internally, someone within your organization starts to define and accept those acceptance criteria. And it's important to do that early on, because if there's something wrong with the acceptance criteria, you can, at a very early stage, go back and say, this acceptance criteria isn't fit for purpose. It doesn't fully meet the user story that I think it does, or my expectations are different. And if it's done early in the process, it allows everybody the ability to address it. Far too often, in my experience, the issues get found far too late in the project, when UAT is a very compressed period of the project. And in some cases, you have to go back to the beginning and then define what the criteria is. And it only comes out when people actually test it. So doing your acceptance criteria and your test plan and your test scripts at the beginning of the implementation cycle is a way to weed that out. If your project is doing an iterative release type model where your tech partner is showing you things as they go, which is a great way to ensure that you can validate and see the solution, then you should really be doing some degree of release testing, which is a great way of breaking down the amount of work that you could find in UAT. So if your technology partner and the agreed plan is to do release testing, then if they're doing 4 or 5 or 7 or 8 sprints, then for each sprint you should do some degree of testing, feed that back to the technology partner so that they can address those. Agile projects absolutely need to include release testing. Waterfall projects typically don't unless they're being implemented in a more iterative fashion. But I'm a big fan of doing release testing because, again, it helps break the back of things before you get to UAT. When you get to UAT, obviously your UAT needs to be set up. You need some sort of test management. And I think test management is a really important topic. Your technology partner can help, but ultimately the test management side of things is about how you are going to manage your team, running your scripts and validating that they do or don't pass, and then being able to feed back those pass or fail criteria back to the technology partner. And then you will effectively go through UAT training to make sure that your users understand how to do testing. And that should be done in concert with them understanding how to use the system itself. So user training needs to happen in concert or before UAT training takes place so that people know how to complete the various revision cycles. And then you get to a review stage where that is really about trying to define a release candidate and getting to a UAT sign-off and a future scope, which might be things that are de-scoped from the go live picture, or sometimes people might refer to it as MVP. Whatever has been agreed that you will go live with at the point of UAT, sometimes things are either seen as not critical or they're too complex to fix in the time frame and they're not important enough, and they might be de-scoped or might be pushed into a later stage. I did want to talk very briefly about a release candidate. A release candidate is a documented way of defining what you accept as going live, and it also acknowledges where there might be low priority bugs that need to be accepted. They will be fixed post go live, but they're not significant to stop you from going live. So a release candidate is a way of getting everybody to agree on what we will go live with and what we won't go live with. And that helps define the future scope for future fixes that might need to be deployed. Assuming everything goes according to plan and you get to a position where your release candidate is successful, you can then go live. And then I thought it was just useful to illustrate that post go live, there's a period of what sometimes get called hypercare or intensive care, where the solution is now live and you do need a sort of increased degree of support from your implementation or your development team or whoever's implemented the product to help support you through that. Now, if we look at who's responsible for producing what of those outputs, or which of those outputs, I've provided a little key there. And so things that are in black are from the technology partner. Things that are in the pink color are shared responsibility. In other words, they may start with the technology partner, but the client needs to take ownership of them and provide the validation and the final ownership of those pieces. And then all the pieces in blue are actually your responsibility. They are the client's responsibility. So it is the client's responsibility to produce the test scripts, to define the test plan, to do the release tests, to set up some sort of internal test management. That could be a spreadsheet. There are dedicated systems that help you manage this, to do the UAT training and to run the revision cycles and to do the UAT sign-off. So I think that helps illustrate the relative responsibilities for the various partners to deliver the various parties to deliver the various outputs that a good and successful test cycle requires. I think what's really important here is I've illustrated a number of runs in UAT, and I think this is something I'd really encourage all of you to do as a key takeaway. At the point that you're agreeing your project, even if you can ask this question early on in the procurement cycle, how many test runs is the technology partner planning on doing in UAT? And what is their commitment to addressing any of those bugs that are identified in UAT. And I don't believe that legal agreements are a good proxy for project management. That's probably the topic of a different webinar. But I do think that getting these things defined in the scope of works that you agree with your technology partner will flesh out any issues early. And if you feel that you need more runs because you've got a bigger project or a bigger, more complex solution needs to be tested, then I would encourage you to try and work that out at the beginning of the project, not when UAT starts. And I have seen far too many times that there is an expectation that there will be more runs. Each UAT run or each UAT cycle does require effort from both parties, and so that can change the costs and efforts required from your technology partner. So really key point, do ask that question early up front so that you can understand what their role will be in UAT and how many times you will run UAT until you achieve success. So I thought there's next section really sort of moves us through to looking at how do you get going? How do you start planning your testing capability and your test plan so that you can get from planning to execution? And here, so just four key steps. So looking at how you start developing your test plan, start with a preparation stage. And really the key thing here is you're planning to succeed. So if you have a plan, you can start identifying gaps and you can start taking action and you can start doing it. So again, I think this should be something that's done really early in the project lifecycle and really starting with testing and defining your test scope and your objectives. So write them down. As always, your objectives should be smart, they should be specific, measurable, actionable, they should be time-based, and they should be practical in every sense of the word. Do look at resources early, again, in your plan. Do you have the skills in your team? Do they understand the role they're going to be playing? Does everybody have clearly defined responsibilities? All of these things can be mapped out. If you're working with a consultancy like us, we have lots of these things as predefined templates that we can provide as part of the engagement. So this shouldn't be terribly difficult, but it does need to be owned by the organization. That could be the organization project manager, it could be a consultancy that you've helped bring in or that you've brought in to help you with the project manager, but it's a client-side responsibility to develop that plan and really setting out the expectation for creating realistic environments for testing. And what I mean by that is if you're going to have a UAT environment, understand the parameters around that UAT environment. Is it going to be used for data? Are you going to be testing on live data? I really advise that you don't do UAT testing on live data, but if you have to, because of the way that the plan has been developed, then have a mitigation for dealing with that. But it has to be realistic and it has to be pragmatic for weeding out the type of scenarios that you need to find. Step 2, start your test case development. So this is really taking the test cases from the acceptance criteria and saying, how can we mirror actual business processes? What can we include as edge cases and error scenarios so that we can actually make the test cases really definitive? Remember that the people who are going to be running these test cases are not qualified quality assurance testers. These are end users who know the solutions, they know the outcomes they're expecting, and they're going to need as much support in running those test cases as possible. Document expected results, what good looks like, what doesn't, and what wrong looks like as well. And help define things in the user's language. Far too often test scripts are written from a very technical perspective, which makes it very difficult for a non-technical user to understand. So when you're writing your test scripts or your test cases, I would encourage writing them from the end user's perspective so that they are easy to understand and easy to follow. Number 3, a really kind of important point here is ensuring that you can engage your test users, your UAT users, early on and make sure that you've got the right skills to be able to do effective user acceptance testing. Try and select a broad range of people from across your organization and from across your departments. I think you should have key people, product owners or solution experts or subject matter experts or product champions, whatever they might be, have them involved. But you also do need people who are not that familiar with the system to test it. If they're going to use the end product in any way, they should be able to test it from their perspective. That helps weed out any issues that might be around kind of the user experience or clarity, or the process might be a little bit more clunky than they're used to, and this can be a really important piece to weed out in the UAT process. Um, Absolutely start providing that training and adoption early within the process, and I would try and find some way of rewarding participation. UAT is challenging. It's not the easiest part of a project. It is the first time really where the client's non-project team gets to take responsibility for something, and so the shock can be a bit harsh, and I think it's important to try and recognize that, manage expectations, but also reward people for participating and make it part of their ability to take ownership of the solution and feel like this is not something that's been done to them, but something that's being done with them and that they're part of the journey. And then really just sort of the sort of more detailed stuff is managing the test process. Um, do use a structured approach. I do find that sometimes UAT, because it's not often done by clients, can be haphazard or a bit fractious. I think it's important that you have a defined testing approach. I would encourage using proven tools that are maybe designed for the job, or just a set of, industry best practice Excel templates, if you like. There's lots of information out there. We will provide a test script at the end of this session so that you can take that and use that. And there are lots of well-defined test capabilities and tools out there that you can rely on. And I think you need a really clear defect reporting process that everybody understands what is a defect, how is it managed, where does it go, and who does what with that defect well before you enter UAT. And then something that's really quite important is defining your prioritization matrix. And this does need to be done with your technology partner. Typically, you will find things being classed as critical, high, medium, and low. And I think it's important that you agree at the project, preferably in the scope of work stage, before you start the kind of implementation stage, understand what the prioritization is and what level of prioritization bugs will be addressed in the revision cycle within UAT. This is an area where I think not sharing those expectations around prioritization does lead to misalignment between the technology partners and the client, and it's often the area where I find the most breakdown in the UAT process, and that's absolutely the last thing that you want. So I'd really encourage you to have a clear prioritization matrix that you can rely on. Moving to risk management and common pitfalls, I think some of these are well known to you. If some of you filled in the poll will have illustrated you're in the process or you've been through this before, you'll know some of these risk issues. But help illustrating those for you who are new to the process or going into it. Let's just look at kind of 8 common risk issues. So lack of buy-in. Remembering that this is, again, going to be a group of users who probably don't know what user acceptance testing is, or their experience of it has been bad in the past. So making sure that everybody understands what the process is, what their expectations are of them, etc., is a great way to make sure that people buy in. And actually, this really should be led from the top. Happy path testing. Let me clarify this one. Happy path testing is where everybody kind of takes a shortcut and says, this is what it will look like if everything goes according to plan. And happy path testing is too simplistic in my experience. And that's why I encourage people to look at and make clear statements of what an error looks like in that particular test case, what it shouldn't do. Because far too often, happy path testing is a result of poorly defined or not deeply enough defined acceptance criteria, which creates a poor test script, and then the solution will pass, but you actually haven't found the bug. And back to that quote, a bug that hasn't been found in UAT will be found by your clients, your customers, your members, your donors, your stakeholders, your volunteers. And that's a very expensive situation to find yourself in, because it's very expensive to fix. Remembering, between 6 to 15 times more expensive to fix something after it's live. So I would discourage happy path testing. Poor resource and budgeting in terms of making sure that you have the right skills and people to look at doing this in the right way, and making sure that they have the time to manage the testing. So that's about backfilling and working with the organization to get everybody to realize that when users take on user acceptance testing, they won't have as much capacity to do their day jobs, and that takes careful planning and even budgeting at times to make sure that you've got backfill to support those people. Scope change. Don't allow the scope to change when you start testing. This is not a time to introduce new things. It can create regression issues. Regression issues are when something gets fixed, and I don't know, maybe this is just me, but if anyone's ever had a builder do any work on their house, they might fix one thing, but they'll break something else. And so if you introduce change in the UAT process, you are opening yourself up to a lot more regression issues. If it's essential, then you need to identify it and make sure that it's a change and not just a tweak or an alteration. And it needs to be documented so that people can understand where the regression issues are coming from. Timeline pressures. Rushed testing results in missed issues or a lack of time to fix them. So I appreciate that projects usually, unfortunately, start with a deadline in mind. I do think that is probably one of the big issues that we find with projects where they're started with a deadline and then worked backwards. And I think that UAT is often the area that gets compressed. So if you're in a project and things are running a bit behind, but you've got a kind of defined deadline, I would strongly encourage and resist compressing the UAT period. So if the UAT period is defined as being 6, 8, 10, or 12 weeks, try and retain that time. And I actually advise clients to descope things rather than compact that time. If you have to compact the time, it really does mean you have to have very, very clear prioritization. Everybody has to know what success looks like in that case. Lack of change management, I think this is a universal one that appears in all projects. People will resist change, so you need to plan for it. You need to communicate. You need to listen and take the feedback on board and act. So if you do start your planning, as we advise, start early. You can deal with these issues. You can listen to people saying, I don't have enough time, or I don't have enough resource. I don't know how to do this. If you do that and you create a feedback loop around the change piece, you can manage this and then you can take action. Not sticking to the specification. UAT is there to validate the specification, the requirements. And so going back to that traceability loop, it's not the time for new requirements. And I do see this happening quite often in UAT, where people will test it and sort of say, okay, technically it does what it's supposed to do in the acceptance criteria, but it actually doesn't meet my expectations. That's valid, but it doesn't mean it's a bug. And so the best thing you can do there is define that as a change, not a bug. If it is clearly something that's new, that wasn't identified, it's best to acknowledge it as a new requirement, go down the change control process rather than introducing it as a bug, because it will cause friction, it will create issues, and it won't get addressed in a timely manner. And then the final one really is poor defect management, lack of rigorous tracking and reporting and verification processes. So again, there are tools that can help you with this. Some of them can be just well-defined Excel spreadsheets. Some of them are actual testing tools that help you manage these things. And I would encourage you to look at these capabilities early on and make sure that you can mitigate that risk. So I think in summary, all of these are mitigatable risks. There are things that you can do to help work through these issues and to help minimize the issues that you might find, and then you can take action and address them. So practical tips for testing success. There are just 5 of these, and that is test case prioritization. We've said this before, but just actually providing some detail here. Focus on critical revenue generating processes first. If the critical processes that are around revenue generation are going to fail, those are the ones that are going to cost you the most to fix. They're going to be the most that will increase your reputational risk, and they are the ones that will cause you lots of governance issues. So address those first. Make sure that those are your highest priority. Then focus on things that are going to be member or beneficiary facing. Anything that is going to be visible to them. And this isn't just the portal. It could be an internal process like processing their payment or processing their renewal or a refund on a donation. These things need to be, even though they might just be internal processes, they will have external consequences. So make sure that those are your second priority. And then third, compliance and regulatory requirements should be your third one. And they're a nice way of wrapping it up and making sure that you've covered those 3. That's not to say that there aren't, 4th or 5th priority level issues, but I think that these are just the 3 that I would suggest doing in terms of defining your priorities. Define product owners. I think this is an area that is a kind of evolution of how projects have evolved. And I think we're seeing this is improving, but you need to define product owners, people within your team who are going to take responsibility for the features. They have to when they're live. And so they really should be trying to take responsibility for them when they're in project and absolutely when they get to UAT. So ensure that the users know and own the processes that are included in the testing. Give them the responsibility to sign them off. That means that they will validate that it's working and it works to their expectations or to the specification they hopefully contributed to at the beginning of the project, and involve them early on and get them to validate the acceptance criteria. It's really important that your product owners, your subject matter experts, your champions look at the acceptance criteria as early as possible and say whether they're happy with it or not. If they're not happy with it, spend the time to get that addressed. If that costs you a little bit more with your technology partner, I promise you it will generate a better result before you get to UAT. Follow the specification. Again, this goes to the point that new features are not bugs. The system must deliver to the specification and meet the acceptance criteria. If 12 months, 16 months, whatever it might be down the line, the thing that's been developed doesn't meet your expectations, that's secondary. It's really important that in UAT, it's defined as, yes, it meets the specification, yes, it meets the acceptance criteria, but it doesn't meet my expectations. That should be the sequence. Far too often, I think people focus just on saying it's about the expectations, and I think it generates a bad outcome. Again, changes are not bugs. Verify that all user stories have clear acceptance criteria before development. So don't look at the acceptance criteria before you start UAT. That's too late. Do the acceptance criteria validation before or at the start of the development process. Identifying gaps. You are going to have gaps. There is just no way that you've got all these bases covered. So start by identifying gaps. Unless you have a dedicated testing capability, you will definitely have gaps in delivery. So address them early, identify where your gaps are, probably around resource and tooling, and come up with a solution at the start of the project. Know what your technology partner will and won't do via a proper testing scope document, right? Most of the technology partners will have this as quite a templatized boilerplate item that they can produce, and it's a good artifact to ask for in discovery so that you can get an understanding of how they're going to manage UAT. If there are any things that don't meet your expectations, again, you have time to address those if you're starting it early. And really, the most challenging one is to create a testing culture, one that empowers your users to take responsibility for the products and involves them, but also makes them accountable for the outcome. And that is the ultimate responsibility. And my advice on this is actually get your project sponsors to participate in UAT and lead and demonstrate positive testing culture from the top, I think is a great way to do that. So in summary, I think before we get to a kind of quick discussion point, I think it's best to see testing as a thread that develops throughout the project. And really, some of these advice pieces over here are just some key points of advice. So develop your plan early. We've spoken about that quite a lot. I think a good metric, and I get asked this question often, each project is different. It really depends on whether you're going down a productized route or something's quite customized to your requirements. That changes the scope of things. But general rule of thumb is 20% of your project's timeline should be allocated to UAT. I think it's impossible to do UAT in less than 6 weeks. And ideally 12 weeks for a larger project where you've got multiple departments and lots of different capability is ideal. Almost never happens, but if you start with that expectation and your timeline gets compressed, then you've already given yourself a little bit of leeway. Try not to work backwards from an ideal go live date and compress UAT. We've spoken about that already. Secure resources early, don't leave it late. Communicate the plan to the broader team as early as you can so that they can feedback and take ownership and know the difference between a bug and a change.
Perfect, Alan. Give you 2 seconds to breathe. So I'm just going to launch a quick poll before we go into some questions, and to say thank you. We have lots of questions and comments coming in, which is great. So really what we're just asking here is, what is your biggest challenge when it comes to testing? So you don't know where to start, you're developing the testing plan, the scripts, getting people to participate, or having the time and resource. So I'm just going to let that run for another second. and I'm going to end poll. And I don't think it's really a surprise that the winner, if there's a winner, is having the time or resources. And then, yeah, followed by getting people to participate and putting together the scripts. Oh, sorry, I haven't shared the results. Let me share the results. So yeah, I don't think there's really anything surprising there. And I suppose on that point, Alan, I want to bring you in again to just talk in a bit more detail about your experience and background. And as I said, we have lots of questions and comments coming in, but I suppose, Alan, you sort of said at the start a little bit about your background and experience, but could you expand on that a little bit more, kind of sort of your previous life and your current life and what the experience that gives you?
Yes. So for good or for bad, depends on your perspective, really. I used to run a software implementation business that used to focus on the membership and charity space, and that was probably going back now a good 15 years. So for the past 15 years, I've been focused on working within the membership and charity sector, delivering software projects. The past year and a half, 2 years have been more from the consultancy side. But that background of delivering projects, and I can see some of the attendees on the call, some people that I know or I've worked with in the past, will know that projects can be complicated. And I think one of the reasons why I think you asked me to sort of lead on this topic was there's that balanced perspective of saying it is hard, it is challenging for the technology partner, it's equally challenging for the client. And really, I just wanted to share some experience and guidance to try and help get over some of these issues that I often see in UAT.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I know when we've been discussing this topic, and I was saying, it's good point is to be able to have that critical friend to go, been there, done it, and seen it on both sides to be, truly honest about it. What would you say are the biggest mistakes that you find that clients make when planning UAT?
I think not being realistic about the scale of the challenge. So it is interesting that people have identified there in the last poll, it's about internal resource. I think that's probably the single biggest one. The second one is really understanding very clearly who's responsible for what. I think that's why I've kind of labored some of these points in today's session, because I think that's very clear. If you understand that and there is a misalignment of expectations, then you can address that. So trying to define those roles and responsibilities and flesh them out and not assuming that, oh, the technology partner will deal with all of that. So that's the area that I think clients are, I think technology partners, and I will put my hands up and say, in the past I've made mistakes as well, probably don't allocate enough time to doing QA internally. And I think that's potentially then a responsibility of the client to ask questions around, what constitutes an accepted thing? How do I know that when you give it to me, it's actually being tested? Are you expecting, us to do the user acceptance testing, and are we effectively doing your QA by the back door? I think having those discussions and understanding what the partner will do and what you will do are a great way to mitigate those issues.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then a question I was going to ask you, but a similar question has come in the Q&A box. So I'm going to ask you that one. It's around outsourcing. So, is there a value in using external specialist consultants to support functionality and UAT testing, or is this something that should ideally be led and owned by us, the client?
Great question. I think going back to the biggest issue that we see here is resource availability. If you don't have the resource, you are not going to be able to magic it up. I think that you will and can and should have the opportunity to engage with external third parties. But I think you need to understand, even though you might engage an external dedicated, testing capability and they're going to work on your behalf, you do still need to recognize that they are not going to be your product owners. They are not going to be the ones that have to use the system don't want to say in anger, but I think that's a bad phrase, but is use it in the real world. 6 months after it goes live, those testing resources won't be there. So it's important that you have that capability to support you, but that you still, as the organization, own the responsibility for the sign-off. UAT is also a really good way of, in the nicest possible way, forcing users to use the new system and to get to grips with it. And that's probably the area where I think more time is needed. because it does start to blur between UAT and training. And I think if you've got more time, you can work that through and you can take it on board. So I try and encourage them not to rush UAT, and definitely don't see it as just something that functionally will happen. It is the icing on the cake. It is the most important factor for ensuring your solution is going to work and not cause you issues or reputational risk.
Yeah, absolutely. Then another question around, when in your previous life as a technology partner, how would you scope out the time required for UAT? And now, would you do that differently, being in the new role that you are now? Would you do anything differently scoping out time on UAT?
Yeah, absolutely. I would. I think I would spend more time working with the client, trying to illustrate that this is actually quite hard, and that um, doing things earlier and trying to get things in place earlier is absolutely the solution. I think encouraging clients to take the responsibility, either by using an external party to help you with these things, um, is potentially a solution to that. I think in the past, um, as a technology partner, we were guilty of going, okay, it's now going over to the client, and they'll figure it out. Ultimately, everybody needs to form a collaborative unit and figure out how to address this issue. And your technology partners can and should help, but they still can't take responsibility for it. So I think the thing that I've identified, or been really working on, since moving from being a technology partner to being in the consultancy, is how do we enable clients to actually address this issue and not just sort of leave it as oh, someone else will deal with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just conscious of time, and I want to make sure I get through as many questions as we can. So Alan, if you just want to move to the next slide, and I'll just run through that quickly, and then I want to bring in the rest of the questions. So really we just wanted to put this in because I suppose the reason why we decided to do this topic today for a webinar is people ask us about it all the time. As I say, UAT isn't easy, and based on kind of our experience, what help is out there, be it us or somebody else, and what can be done. So really just looking at the different ways that there is support around either putting together that strategy, figuring out what it is you need right from the start, looking at kind of best practice approaches, and the ability to, be able to make recommendations on specialist partners, that kind of thing. But also on the testing side, that end-to-end testing management, the planning around that, putting the strategies together, support around the test case creation, the review, and all of that. So just really to say, because we've been asked about this a lot around what support we offer. So I'm not going to go into this in detail because I want to get into the rest of the questions. So you can move on the deck, Alan, and then I'm going to bombard you with some more questions. Um, so you mentioned about a timeline. I know we've touched on this quite a bit. We mentioned a timeline. What does a realistic UAT timeline look like, especially for teams like ours where people are wearing multiple hats?
Difficult to know because like I said, it depends on how complicated the project is. If you're in the membership space and it's CRM and portal, and then the portal becomes part of the website, and you're introducing new marketing automation solutions, all of those things that you add into the project should will probably elongate the timeline. Um, there are other scenarios in the charity sector as well. So I think it really can be a function. Absolute minimum of 6 weeks. I think ideally trying to get to 12 weeks is better. And I don't think that you really look at it, if you had 12 weeks, that your team should spend the whole 12 weeks working on it. If you have the extra time, then you could do 2 weeks on, 1 week off, 2 weeks on, 1 week off, 2 weeks on. And in those off weeks, you're giving the technology partner time to fix things. I think what we typically see is that it's a marathon to get through. And so what will happen is that the client will go at the last minute, here you go, I've got 200 bugs that the project needs to address, and there's a week. And you just don't have to be a genius. It's just not possible to actually do a good job on fixing those. So the more time you can provide, the better everyone will be in terms of providing it. But there is no hard and fast rule. I
Yeah.
do think less than 6 weeks becomes nigh on impossible to complete 2 cycles and allow someone the opportunity to fix them. The other factor that influences that is if you're product based. If your buying a productized solution, which means that you're going to do things the way the product does. The product should be, one of the benefits of going down a productized route is that it should have been tested a lot more because it's not subject to so much customization. If you're honest about how customized your solution is because it's doing things that are unique to your organization, your UAT needs to expand by the same ratio.
Yeah, yeah. As the realism on all of these projects, trying to rush things is never have a happy outcome. Okay, so how much user involvement is too much? We don't want to overcomplicate things with too many cooks. Good question.
Um, I think it goes back to the kind of testing culture piece. If people are part of the team and they understand the purpose and they're trying to, with the best intentions, get a good quality product, then I think involving people is a good thing. If you need them to do the testing and you don't involve them early on and you don't bring them along for the hearts and minds piece and be honest about it, that yes, this is hard work, but we'll do it all together. We'll bring in pizza and we'll make it fun, or we'll try and make it fun and we'll do it all together. I think if you don't do those things, you are going to find people resisting, and it's the worst time for people to resist because they will find things that aren't necessarily bugs. They aren't necessarily go live stoppers, but if you don't bring them along, they will create those things because they don't want to do something that's been done to them. If they're part of it, then they will. So I appreciate that too many cooks is a problem that we do see. I think you need to go back to the responsibilities and make sure that if you've got a lot of users, you've got people with the right responsibilities. So in the nicest possible way, if they're just, um, lower level functional testing the process, then you want them on board, but you don't have to take all of their input on board. If they're more important, they're subject matter experts or departmental champions or they're product owners, then you have to take their feedback on board and work with them to define a solution. On that point, I would say one thing, and this is just maybe about life. If people bring you problems in UAT without solutions, then they're not helping. So set that culture up that if you come to me with a problem and you don't have a solution and you've got a deadline, you're not helping. So set that expectation up early, I think, is one way to deal with that issue.
That's a very good piece of advice. So I'm just conscious of time. There's two questions that are similar, but I did want to cover it. So this is more thinking about technical knowledge. So we're a small charity with limited digital experience. How technical do we need to be to run UAT properly? And the other question around what are some effective ways to engage non-technical users in UAT without overwhelming them? So I suppose the overarching question, how technical do you need to be to do UAT?
I don't think you should be technical to do UAT. I think technical people are needed, and those are people like BAs, and they should be involved in data testing and integration testing. And there is a role for very technical people to play in testing overall. That's great. But I think if you're not technical, I think your perspective as a non-technical person is essential to making sure that the product actually works, right? So if non-technical people are saying, yes, but it doesn't work, that is the ultimate arbitrator of success, because at the end of the day, you will have more non-technical people using your system than you will technical people. So technical people have a role to play, but I don't think they're the most important people, and I wouldn't have that as something you're concerned about. I would say embrace it and be pragmatic about it. I think where there is a challenge is that when the technology, technical people come back and say, yes, but it can't work that way because of these practical reasons, you do need to be able to trust and to listen and take that feedback on board.
Perfect. So I'm going to stop there with questions because we can't get through all of the rest of them. But we will follow up on all the questions that we haven't answered. So I'm going to hand back to you, Alan.
Yeah, I think actually, Joyce, because we've got some great questions, some really intelligent questions, I'm
Yeah.
really pleased to see there's some great questions there. We'll probably put these up on LinkedIn
Yeah.
on a special group. Might take us by the end of the day, but we'd like to continue this discussion via LinkedIn in a forum style. So hopefully you can all join us there. That'd be great. Thank you. Those are some great questions. Looking forward to participating more in them online. Just in terms of wrapping things up, I thought this is actually a really nice quote, and again from a gentleman who was around before the concept of UAT existed, but I still think the concept holds water. The bitterness of poor quality remains long after the sweetness of meeting the schedule meeting the schedule has been forgotten. And that was from the co-founder of Rolls-Royce, and let's be honest, those people know how to produce quality cars. So I think there's some good advice in there. Before we wrap it up, I thought I'd just give some final tips. A good UAT turns a go live from a nightmare into a celebration. And I think I have seen some projects where getting through UAT and doing it in a really defined and structured way can generate a really good project. UAT isn't just about testing software, it's about ensuring that the investment delivers the value that your organization needs. So it needs investment in itself, it shouldn't be neglected, and proper planning and user engagement are essential. Expert support can significantly improve the outcome. You still own the problem though, and the earlier you start in the project, you will pay dividends. So before we wrap it up and thank everybody, just a reminder, TechSmart is back 23rd of September. It is an excellent event. So if you are interested in joining, please take a look at registration is open. We will push the link out in the recording that we send out later. And again, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us this morning. I hope you have a fantastic day, and please do look out for our other events on our Events Hub.